Business Adventures: 12 Classic Tales from the World of Wall Street by John Brooks. Picture this. Bill Gates walks up to Warren Buffett and asks him a straightforward question: what's your favorite book about business? Think about that for a second. One of history's most successful entrepreneurs asking one of history's most legendary investors for advice. You'd expect Buffett to recommend some cutting-edge strategy guide or dense analytical textbook, right? Instead, Buffett walks to his bookshelf and pulls out his personal, well-worn copy of a book that was already decades old when he first discovered it. He hands it to Gates. The title? Business Adventures by John Brooks. Gates devoured it. Later, he called it the best business book he'd ever read. Even though these stories unfolded decades ago, he found them more insightful and timeless than anything modern business schools were teaching. So what makes this particular book capture the attention of two of the sharpest minds in modern history? That's exactly what we're here to uncover. John Brooks wasn't some high-powered CEO or Wall Street analyst. He was a writer for The New Yorker, a master storyteller who understood something crucial. Business isn't really about spreadsheets and charts. It's about people. It's about drama, ambition, pride, spectacular failures, and those rare flashes of genius that reshape everything. Today, we're diving into 12 stories from a different era that somehow feel remarkably current. You'll witness the spectacular collapse of a car designed to be perfect, the mind-bending rise of a company built on an invention nobody thought they needed, and a high-stakes showdown between a maverick from Memphis and the titans of Wall Street. Here's what I promise you: by the time we're done, you won't just know these stories. You'll understand the single powerful force connecting all of them, the same force driving every success and failure in business, from ancient times to this very moment. Once you grasp it, you'll have a genuine advantage in whatever path you choose. Let's jump in. There's a legendary story about the famous financier J.P. Morgan. A hopeful young man once approached him and asked, "Mr. Morgan, what's the stock market going to do?" Morgan looked at him without even a hint of a smile and delivered a two-word answer that's echoed through Wall Street for over a century. He said, "It will fluctuate." That might sound like a clever non-answer, but it's actually one of the most profound truths ever spoken about money, markets, and human nature. What Morgan meant was that the business world isn't a machine. It's not a predictable equation. It's a living, breathing organism, driven by the most unpredictable force on earth: human emotion. It's a constant drama of greed and fear, hope and panic, all playing out on a massive stage. And sometimes, that fluctuation happens so violently, it can bring the entire system to its knees in mere hours. That's exactly what happened on a Monday in May 1962. The economy was humming along nicely, but for some reason, the stock market had been feeling jittery for a few weeks. Then, on the morning of Monday, May 28th, something snapped. The market opened calmly enough, but within minutes, a wave of selling began. Not a trickle, a wave. Stock prices started dropping. And as they dropped, the selling intensified. People watching from the sidelines got spooked and started selling too. The fear was feeding on itself, growing stronger with each passing minute. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, chaos erupted. Brokers were running, shouting, pushing through crowds. But the real drama was happening, with the technology meant to keep everything orderly. Back then, every trade was printed on a long, thin ribbon of paper called the ticker tape, the market's heartbeat. And on this day, that heartbeat was falling dangerously behind. Trades were happening so fast, the ticker machine, running at maximum speed, couldn't keep up. By 11 in the morning, the tape was 20 minutes late. By noon, it was nearly 40 minutes behind. Think about what that means. The prices people saw on the tape weren't real prices. They were ghosts of prices from almost an hour ago. People were selling stocks thinking they were getting one price, only to discover they'd gotten a much, much lower one. It was like navigating a ship through a storm with an hour-old map. The panic spread from Wall Street to Main Street. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with news flashes about the crash. In Merrill Lynch offices, the country's biggest brokerage firm, something strange was happening. The lobby was filling with what brokers called walk-ins, ordinary people, not serious investors who just wanted to watch the numbers fall. They were drawn to the disaster like bystanders at a fire. The office manager knew this was a terrible sign. The more walk-ins he saw, the worse the panic had become. By day's end, the market had suffered its worst single-day drop since the Great Crash of 1929. $20 billion in value, gone. Simply vanished into thin air. That night, Wall Street became a graveyard of broken confidence. Brokers worked through the night sending out telegrams called margin calls, demanding money from investors whose accounts had been wiped out. Many leading experts were privately predicting a full-blown depression. But then came Tuesday. The market opened, and the selling continued even more frantically than Monday. For the first 90 minutes, it was pure black panic. It felt like 1929 all over again. But then, just before noon, something incredible happened. The momentum shifted. A few brave buyers started nibbling at the bargain-priced stocks. Then, a few more. TNT, a key stock that had been leading the market down, suddenly found its footing. It hit a low of $98 and bounced back. It touched that bottom 3 times, and each time it held. Then, a broker for the Dreyfus Fund stepped into the crowd and placed a massive order to buy 10,000 shares of AT&T right at the psychological barrier of $100. That single act of confidence was like a flare in the darkness. Suddenly, everyone wanted in. The fear of losing money was replaced by a new, more powerful fear, the fear of missing out. The selling panic transformed into a buying frenzy. The market roared upward with even more force than it had fallen. By closing time, it had recovered almost 3/4 of Monday's terrifying losses. When the closing bell finally rang, a huge cheer erupted from the trading floor. They weren't cheering because they'd made money. They were cheering because it was over. They had stared into the abyss, and for 2 terrifying days, the abyss had stared back. The 1962 flash crash perfectly captures the irrational, emotional, deeply human world of business. John Brooks uses this story to show us that no matter how much we surround ourselves with computers and data, at the heart of it all is the same cocktail of fear and greed that drove Dutch tulip traders in the 1600s. There were no real economic reasons for the crash. It was a crisis of confidence, a fluctuation. This idea that human perception, not just reality, shapes business outcomes, is the thread tying together all the stories in business adventures. And nowhere is that lesson more powerfully or more painfully illustrated than in the cautionary tale of a car meant to be the future that instead became a legendary failure. This is the story of the Edsel. In 1955, the Ford Motor Company was riding high. It was the golden age of American automobiles. Cars were getting bigger, wider, more powerful, and dripping with chrome. And Ford spotted a gap in the market. They noticed that as families earned more money, they would trade up from a basic Ford to a more expensive, medium-priced car. The problem? They weren't trading up to Ford's own medium-priced car, the Mercury. They were buying from General Motors. Ford was, as one executive put it, growing customers for General Motors. So they decided to create a brand new car, so perfectly designed and meticulously researched that it would capture the hearts and wallets of America's rising middle class. This was going to be the biggest, most expensive product launch in history. The company poured $250 million in 1950s money into the project. It was known simply as the E-car for experimental. First, they tried to figure out the car's personality. They hired sociologists and market researchers to discover what people felt about different cars. The results were fascinating. They found that a Chevrolet was seen as wise and sensible, maybe a clergyman's car. A Ford was seen as masculine, fast, and a bit wild. A Buick was for doctors or lawyers, people with status. But a Mercury was seen as a hot rod, a car for young, reckless drivers. No wonder people weren't trading up to it. It had the wrong image. So the researchers at Ford decided the e-car needed the perfect personality. After thousands of interviews, they came up with the magic formula. The e-car would be the smart car for the younger executive or professional family on its way up. It would be for ambitious, sophisticated people who wanted the world to know they had good taste. Next came the name. This was a massive undertaking. They hired advertising agencies, polled people on the streets of New York and Chicago, and generated over 6,000 names. They tested for free associations. For example, the name Corsair made people think of pirates and swashbucklers. That was good. In a moment of creative desperation, they even wrote to the famous poet Marianne Moore, asking for help. She sent back wonderfully strange suggestions, including the utopian turtle top and the mongoose civique. Ford politely declined. In the end, after all the science and research, the decision was made in a single, abrupt moment. The chairman of the board, Ernest Breach, looked at the final list and said he didn't like any of them. He said, "Let's call it Edsel, after Henry Ford's late father, Edsel Ford." Just like that, the utopian turtle top became the Edsel. Many inside the company were horrified. The name felt old-fashioned. It had clumsy associations: pretzel, diesel, hard sell. The market researchers felt their scientific work had been tossed aside for family sentiment. But the decision was final. For the next 2 years, Ford built up the suspense. They ran mysterious ads showing a blurred car on a highway or a car covered in a white sheet. They told the public, quote, "The Edsel is on its way." The hype was enormous. People were expecting a dream car, something straight out of science fiction. Then, on September 4, 1957, E-Day, the Edsel was finally unveiled, and the public's reaction was confusion. The car's most distinctive feature was its vertical front grille, supposed to look unique and sophisticated like a classic European car. But to most Americans, it looked, well, people were unkind. They said it looked like a toilet seat, or like an Oldsmobile sucking a lemon. The rest of the car was just a collection of every mid-50s trend. Giant tail fins, tons of chrome, and a dizzying array of push buttons, including a cluster for the automatic transmission right in the center of the steering wheel. It was a perfectly average, gaudy car from 1955. The problem: this was late 1957. The country's mood had shifted. The economy was heading into a recession. And just a month after the Edsel's launch, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Suddenly, America's confidence was shaken. The obsession with flashy, gas-guzzling status symbols began to feel silly. People started wanting smaller, more sensible cars. The Edsel was the right car for the wrong time. It was a giant step in the wrong direction. Worse, the first Edsels rolling off the assembly line were plagued with mechanical problems. Trunks wouldn't open, hoods stuck, paint jobs were poor, and those fancy push buttons often didn't work at all. Sales were disastrous. Ford had hoped to sell 200,000 in the first year. They sold just over 60,000. The next year was even worse. Finally, in November 1959, just 2 years after its grand debut, Ford quietly discontinued the Edsel. The $250 million car had turned into a $350 million loss. The Edsel story is often told as a simple lesson: don't let market research design your products. But John Brooks shows us it's more complicated. Ford ignored the research when it came to the name and design. The real failure of the Edsel was a failure of human judgment. It was a product of committee thinking, a car built by looking in the rearview mirror. It was designed for a world that, by the time the car arrived, no longer existed. It shows that in business, timing isn't just one thing, it's everything. And it's a powerful reminder that what people say they want and what they actually want are two very different things. But for every story of monumental failure based on misunderstanding the public, there's a story of impossible success built on an idea no one thought they needed. While Ford was pouring a fortune into a car that was a variation on a familiar theme, a tiny struggling company in Rochester, New York, was betting its entire existence on a strange invention that came out of a makeshift lab above a bar in Queens. This is the story of Xerox. In 1938, a quiet, methodical inventor named Chester Carlson was working in a patent office in New York. He was frustrated by how difficult it was to make copies of documents. The only option was to retype them with carbon paper or use a slow, messy photographic process. He thought, there has to be a better way. In his spare time, in a tiny kitchen he'd turned into a laboratory, he began experimenting with static electricity and light. His idea was completely new. He figured out that he could project an image of a document onto a specially coated surface, use a fine black powder to stick to the parts of the image that had an electrical charge, then transfer that powder onto paper and fuse it with heat. He called his invention electrophotography. On October 22, 1938, he made his first successful copy. On a small piece of paper, he had transferred the words, October 22, 38 Astoria. It was a historic moment, a true breakthrough. But when Carlson tried to sell his invention, nobody was interested. For the next 5 years, he approached every major office equipment company in the country, IBM, General Electric, RCA, and every single one turned him down. They couldn't see a market for it. Why would anyone want a big, expensive machine to make copies? Carbon paper worked just fine. Finally, in 1944, a non-profit research organization called the Battelle Memorial Institute agreed to help develop the process in exchange for a share of royalties. A few years later, a small company in Rochester called the Haloid Company heard about the invention. Haloid made photographic paper and was struggling to compete with its giant neighbor, Eastman Kodak. The president of Haloid, a man named Joseph C. Wilson, was looking for something new, something that could save his company. He went to see Carlson's invention. He watched a man rubbing a piece of metal with cat's fur to create a static charge. It was crude, clumsy, and messy. But Wilson saw something all those giant corporations had missed. He saw the future. Haloid made a deal with Battelle and began pouring all its resources into developing the process. They renamed it xerography, from the Greek words for dry writing. The journey was long and incredibly difficult. The technical problems seemed endless. At one point, Haloid scientists were so discouraged, they almost gave up. The company was spending far more money on research than it was making from regular business. It was borrowing heavily, selling stock to anyone who would buy. The executives mortgaged their homes to keep the project alive. They were betting the entire company on this one unproven idea. Then, in 1959, after more than a decade of work and an investment of over $75 million, they finally introduced their first automatic office copier, the Xerox 914. The effect was explosive. Unlike other copiers, the 914 could make sharp, dry copies on ordinary paper at the push of a button. It was easy to use and fast. And it turned out people didn't just want to make a few copies. They wanted to make billions of them. The Xerox 914 has been called the single most successful product ever manufactured. The company's sales went from $33 million in 1959 to over $500 million by 1966. The stock price soared so high, it created a whole class of Xerox millionaires. The University of Rochester, which had invested in the struggling company out of local loyalty, made a profit of over $100 million. And Chester Carlson, the quiet inventor from the kitchen lab, became one of the richest men in America. So why did the Edsel fail and Xerox succeed? Brooks's telling of these two stories, side by side, reveals a profound truth about business. The Edsel was an attempt to give people more of what they already had. It was a product of consensus, of committees, of looking backward. Xerox, on the other hand, was a true revolution. It wasn't an improvement. It was a transformation. It created a need people didn't even know they had. The failure of the Edsel and the success of Xerox are clear-cut stories of the marketplace. But business isn't always so black and white. Often, the biggest battles aren't fought in the showroom or the lab, but in the murky gray zone of ethics, law, and human communication. This brings us to a scandal that shook one of America's most admired corporations to its core. In 1961, the business world was shocked to learn that 29 of the biggest companies in the electrical manufacturing industry, including giants like General Electric and Westinghouse, had been caught in a massive conspiracy to fix prices and rig bids on government contracts. These weren't small-time crooks. These were respected, high-level executives, pillars of their communities, who had been secretly meeting in hotel rooms across the country to carve up the market. They used code numbers for their companies, made phone calls from payphones, and falsified expense reports to cover their tracks. When caught, several were sent to prison. It was the biggest business scandal in decades. The question everyone asked was, how could this happen? Especially at a company like General Electric, which had a famously strict company rule, Directive 20.5, that explicitly forbade any contact with competitors about prices. Every executive had to sign this directive every year. John Brooks's chapter on this scandal, The Impacted Philosophers, is a masterpiece of investigative storytelling. What he uncovered wasn't a simple story of corporate greed, but a tragic comedy of miscommunication so profound it would be funny if it weren't so serious. It turned out that for years, many GE executives believed Directive 20.5 was just for show. They thought it was legal window dressing, and that the real, unwritten rule was to meet with competitors to stabilize the market. One executive, William Ginn, testified that when his boss would order him to obey the antitrust laws, he would often give a subtle wink. The wink meant, "You know what I really mean, go to the meeting." Ginn said he was torn between two sets of bosses. One group, whom he called the philosophers that were selling the Lord, told him to follow the rules. But another group, the people who were advocating the devil, were more persuasive. They told him price fixing was just part of the game. The problem was, nobody was speaking clearly. A subordinate had to guess whether his boss's order meant what it said or the exact opposite. A boss had to guess whether his subordinate's report was literal truth or secret code. One executive, Raymond Smith, testified that he tried to tell his new boss, Arthur Vinson, that he was meeting with competitors. But he did it cryptically. He'd say something like, "I had a meeting with the Klan this morning." Vinson later swore under oath he had no idea what the Klan meant. He thought it meant GE's own sales team. He testified, "I may be naive, but I am certainly telling the truth. And in this kind of thing, I am sure I am naive." The senator questioning him replied, "Mr. Vinson, you wouldn't be a vice president at $200,000 a year if you were naive." Vinson's answer was chilling. He said, "I think I could well get there by being naive in this area. It might help." What he was admitting was that, in the complex world of a giant corporation, not knowing, or at least being able to say you didn't know, could be key to survival and promotion. The entire system was built on a foundation of deliberate ambiguity. The men at the top could maintain their innocence, while the men in the middle took the risks and, ultimately, the fall. The GE scandal wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about a corporate culture where nobody could speak the truth, perhaps not even to themselves. It's a powerful lesson that the most important communication in any organization isn't what's written in the policy manuals. It's what's understood in the silences, the winks, and the coded language. The GE executives were playing a hidden, dangerous game, but sometimes the games in business are played right out in the open for all the world to see. And no game was ever played with more fire, drama, and audacity than when a man from Memphis tried to corner the market on a stock called Piggly Wiggly. Today, the idea of cornering a stock seems like something out of an old movie. But in the 1920s, it was very real and very dangerous. High-stakes poker played on the floor of the stock exchange. Here's how it worked. You have two kinds of players: bulls, who bet a stock will go up, and bears, who bet it will go down. A bear often bets by selling short. That means he sells stock he doesn't actually own. He borrows it from a broker, sells it, and hopes the price will drop. If it does, he can buy the stock back at the lower price, return what he borrowed, and pocket the difference. The old Wall Street saying goes, "He who sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison." A corner happens when a powerful bull secretly buys up all the available stock, the stock that's floating around for trading. If he succeeds, he has the bears in a trap. When they have to buy the stock back to return what they borrowed, there's only one person they can buy it from: him. And he can charge them any price he wants. It was a brutal game, and Clarence Saunders, the founder of the Piggly Wiggly grocery store chain, decided to play it. Saunders was a one-of-a-kind character, a flamboyant promoter from Memphis. He'd invented the modern supermarket. He was building himself a massive home called the Pink Palace, made of pink marble, complete with its own private golf course. He was, as he liked to say, a boob from Tennessee, and he had a deep suspicion of the slick manipulators on Wall Street. In 1922, a group of Wall Street bears decided to attack his company's stock. They spread rumors that Piggly Wiggly was in trouble and began selling it short, driving the price down. Saunders was furious. He decided to fight back. He took out a $10 million loan from a group of Southern bankers and launched a buying campaign to support his stock. He also took out a series of fiery newspaper ads. "Shall the gambler rule?" one asked. "On a white horse he rides. Bluff is his coat of mail, and thus shielded is a yellow heart." At first, he just wanted to drive the price up, but as he kept buying, he realized he had an opportunity to do something more. He could corner the stock and crush the bears completely. By March 1923, he'd done it. He controlled almost every single one of the 200,000 outstanding shares of Piggly Wiggly. The bears were trapped. On the morning of March 20th, he called for all the stock he was owed. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange exploded into chaos. The short sellers were desperate. They needed to buy Piggly Wiggly stock, and there was none to be had. The price shot up from $75 to $90 to $100 to $124. Saunders was in Memphis, watching his plan unfold perfectly. He was about to become fantastically rich and teach Wall Street a lesson it would never forget. But he'd underestimated his enemy. The governors of the stock exchange, seeing that some of their own members were among the trapped bears, did something unprecedented. They changed the rules in the middle of the game. They announced they were suspending all trading in Piggly Wiggly stock. And, more importantly, they gave the short sellers 5 extra days to find the stock they needed to deliver. Saunders was enraged. He called the exchange a, quote, bunch of welchers, but his corner was broken. The extra time allowed the bears to scour the country and find small lots of stock held by private investors who were happy to sell at a huge profit. Instead of being forced to buy from Saunders at his price, they could now buy from others. The great Piggly Wiggly corner had collapsed. Saunders, who'd been on the verge of massive victory, was financially ruined. He lost control of his company, his fortune, and his beloved Pink Palace, which was eventually turned into a city museum. He never recovered financially, but he never lost his spirit. He spent the rest of his life trying to invent a fully automated grocery store called the Edsel. It never quite worked. The story of Clarence Saunders is the story of the last great corner. It's a tale of ambition, pride, and the raw, unregulated power that once defined Wall Street. It shows a world where the rules weren't always fixed, and where the game could be just as much about who you knew as how you played. These stories of crashes, failures, successes, scandals, and duels are about the mechanics of business. But what about the heart of it? What about moments when business is forced to confront something bigger than profits? In November 1963, Wall Street was about to face one of those moments. A brokerage firm called Ira Haupt and Company was in deep trouble. They'd made a huge, reckless bet on behalf of a single client, a man named Anthony DeAngelis, who was speculating in vegetable oil futures. DeAngelis had borrowed tens of millions of dollars from Haupt, using warehouse receipts for giant tanks of salad oil as collateral. But on Friday, November 15th, the price of vegetable oil started to drop. Haupt asked DeAngelis for more money to cover his losses. He couldn't provide it. Then the terrible truth began to emerge. The warehouse receipts were fake. The giant tanks in Bayonne, New Jersey, that were supposed to be full of oil were mostly full of water. DeAngelis had pulled off one of the biggest frauds in modern history. Ira Haupt and Company wasn't just in trouble, it was insolvent, it was bankrupt. This was a serious problem for Wall Street, but it was about to become part of a much larger national tragedy. On Friday, November 22nd, at 1:40 p.m., the first garbled reports of President Kennedy's assassination reached the floor of the stock exchange. In the next 27 minutes, as the country reeled in shock and horror, the market went into freefall. The Board of Governors had to close the exchange to stop the panic. Now the 20,000 customers of Ira Haupt and Company were in a terrifying position. Their accounts were frozen. And if the firm went into bankruptcy, their stocks would have to be sold into a panic-stricken market, likely at catastrophic losses. These were ordinary people who'd done nothing wrong. They'd never heard of Anthony DeAngelis or his phantom salad oil, but they were about to lose their savings because of his fraud and the brokerage firm's recklessness. That afternoon, in the midst of national grief, a group of the most powerful men on Wall Street gathered at the stock exchange. They were led by the exchange's president, G. Keith Funston. He laid out the situation. Haupt was finished. In the normal course of events, it would go into bankruptcy, and its innocent customers would suffer devastating losses. But Funston proposed something extraordinary, something with almost no precedent. He proposed that the member firms of the New York Stock Exchange, Haupt's competitors, should use their own money to make the customers whole. They would step in and cover the losses, ensuring that every single one of Haupt's 20,000 customers got back every penny of their money and every share of their stock. It was a radical idea. Why should successful, well-run firms have to pay for the mistakes of a reckless one? But Funston argued that more than money was at stake. At a moment of grave national crisis, the integrity of the entire financial system was on the line. The public's trust was the most valuable asset Wall Street had, and at that moment it was fragile. Over that terrible weekend, while the nation mourned, the leaders of Wall Street hammered out a deal. They negotiated with the big banks that had also been defrauded by DeAngelis, persuading them to wait for their money until the small customers had been paid. The final amount needed was $9.5 million. The member firms of the exchange put up the money. It was a quiet act, done with no fanfare, but it was a profound moment in the history of American business. It was a moment when an industry decided that its responsibility to the public was more important than its own bottom line. It was a recognition that, in the end, the system is built not on rules or regulations, but on trust. The stories in Business Adventures aren't just about business. They're about human nature under pressure. And perhaps no one in the book represents that pressure more than David Lilienthal. Lilienthal was one of the giants of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. He was the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, a massive government project that brought electricity to the rural South. To many in the business community, he was the face of galloping socialism. He then became the first chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, putting him at the center of the most powerful and terrifying technology on Earth. But in 1950, at age 50, he decided to leave government. He wanted to start what he called a, quote, second sort of life. He wanted to enter the world he'd so often been at odds with, the world of private business. He came to Wall Street with considerable trepidation. He was worried he wouldn't be able to make a living. But he also had deep curiosity. He wanted to see if the world of business was really the jungle he'd always imagined. He became a consultant and eventually the head of a small, struggling minerals company, and he found that the world of business wasn't at all what he expected. He discovered that financiers could be creative and honorable. He found the challenge of taking a failing company and building it into something successful to be deeply satisfying. And, to his own surprise, through a stock option plan, he became a millionaire. But he also felt something was missing. The sense of public purpose that had driven him in government was gone. He'd made a fortune, but he wondered if he'd lost a part of himself. His solution was to create a new kind of company, the Development and Resources Corporation. It was a private, for-profit firm backed by Wall Street money, but its mission was to do the kind of work he'd done at the TVA, building dams, irrigating deserts, and bringing power to underdeveloped regions around the world, from Iran to Colombia. In this new venture, Lilienthal finally found a way to bridge his two lives. He was using the tools of private enterprise to achieve the goals of public service. His story is a powerful reminder that the line between business and doing good doesn't have to be a wall, it can be a door. And so, through these 12 classic tales, John Brooks paints a rich and complex portrait of the world of business. He shows us the absurdity of a system like the federal income tax, a law so complicated and full of loopholes that it creates two kinds of money: before-tax money and after-tax money. He takes us inside the strange theater of the annual stockholder meeting, where a handful of professional stockholders wage a lonely and often comical war against the powerful managers of giant corporations. But through it all, the central message remains the same. Whether it's the panic of a stock market crash, the hubris of a failed car launch, the quiet genius of a world-changing invention, or the moral confusion of a price-fixing scandal, the story of business is, and always will be, the story of people. When you read business adventures, the first thing that strikes you is how little things have changed. These stories took place 50, 60, even 100 years ago. They talk about technologies that seem ancient and companies that are no longer household names. Yet, the human element in each story feels like it could have happened yesterday. The tale of the Edsel is the story of every startup today that launches a product based on flawed assumptions about its customers. The story of Xerox is the dream of every innovator who believes in an idea when no one else does. The GE scandal is a timeless lesson in how a toxic corporate culture can lead good people to do bad things. And the flash crash of 1962 is a chilling reminder that our modern, high-tech markets are still driven by the same primal emotions of fear and greed. The great lesson of this book, the secret that Buffett and Gates saw so clearly, is that the principles of business aren't found in formulas or algorithms. They're found in the unchanging truths of human nature. Technology evolves, markets fluctuate, and laws are rewritten, but people are people. We're driven by ambition, blinded by pride, paralyzed by fear, and inspired by great ideas. The person who understands this, who studies people as much as they study spreadsheets, is the one who will have the true advantage. So what can we take away from these stories for our own lives? First, character is the most valuable asset you'll ever have. In the story of the Haupt bailout, in the middle of a national crisis, the leaders of Wall Street weren't guided by a rulebook. They were guided by a sense of responsibility. They understood that in the long run, trust is worth more than any short-term profit. Your reputation, your integrity, that's the currency that will truly matter in the moments that count. Second, a great product is more powerful than great marketing. Ford spent millions trying to create a quote personality for the Edsel. They came up with a perfect slogan for a car nobody wanted. Haloid, on the other hand, had a product so revolutionary it sold itself. It solved a problem people didn't even know they had. Focus on creating real value, on making something that genuinely helps people, and the success will follow. Don't just try to sell a story. Be the story. And finally, failure is often a better teacher than success. The story of the Edsel, in its own way, is just as valuable as the story of Xerox. It teaches us about humility, about the danger of believing your own hype, and about the courage to admit when you're wrong and move on. Clarence Saunders lost his fortune, but he never lost his spirit. He kept trying to build, to create, to invent. He understood that the real adventure isn't in winning or losing, but in the playing of the game. That was a summary of Business Adventures, 12 Classic Tales from the World of Wall Street by John Brooks. We've explored some incredible stories and timeless lessons from this book today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you make the journey yourself. The true magic of this book is in John Brooks's storytelling, in the rich detail and human drama that make these events come alive. This summary is just a starting point, a way for you to see if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or made you think, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning business lessons. It's an experience that will change how you see the world of money, power, and human ambition. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found value in our time together today, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know that these journeys are worthwhile, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.